By the time the travel writer Pausanias made his way across Greece in the 2nd century AD, at the very height of the Roman Empire and the peace and prosperity that came with it, the world of the Bronze Age was long in the past. The great tombs and citadels of those ancestors of well over 1,000 years before, lying largely forgotten, overgrown, or lost. A handful, though, lived on in memory, even then. The very mightiest and greatest of all, still revered by the people of the surrounding region, just as it is today. We know it as Mycenae. Its mythic association with Agamemnon of the Trojan War and his mighty predecessors never having been lost. Such was the prestige and power of its longevity that when archaeologists first arrived to excavate the place in the 19th century, they gave its name to the entire archaeological culture, spanning the Greek mainland and beyond in those distant days. For among the network of palatial centres that once controlled Mycenaean civilization, gradually being rediscovered and investigated during that gilded age of discovery, Mycenae was undoubtedly the largest, the most powerful, and the one which looms greatest in the mythic and historical traditions. The seat of very real, archaeologically visible high kings, who at one point very likely acted as hegemons of both land and sea, directly ruling the undisputed centre of the Greek world in the Argolid region of the northwestern Peloponnese. Perhaps also with a wider realm spanning anywhere from the home of the gods at Mount Olympus in Thessaly to the Aegean Islands, Crete, and even coastal Asia Minor beyond. Standing on a mighty hilltop some 10 miles from the Gulf of Argolis to the south and 15 miles to the Saronic Gulf to the east, with line of sight stretching off in all directions, Mycenae holds an immensely favourable strategic position. In constant view of the vast, holy mountain looming over it. Thought to have held religious significance. The famed Lion Gate, in turn, looked down on all visitors to the citadel. Those 2 lions or lionesses, a source of pride for the locals, served to intimidate and impress foreign diplomats, as well as to see off the great Achaean kings as they departed with their armies to new battles and conquest. Though we know today that the very first settlers at Mycenae made their homes on the hilltop in the Neolithic, as early as 6000 BC, the developments that led to the impressive Bronze Age ruins we see today are thought to have begun in the 3rd millennium BC. During the era we know now as the Early Helladic, when metallurgy and complex farming techniques first made their way into the Aegean. As far as the Greeks themselves were concerned, the earliest legend of the foundation, or at least etymology, of Mycenae is recorded only vaguely in the epic poetic tradition. In works attributed to Homer and the similarly lauded contemporary poet Hesiod. Works attributed to both poets link the name of the city to a nymph called Mycenae, a daughter of Inachus, the legendary first king of Argolis. Works attributed to both poets linking the name of the city. By the time Pausanias came through in the 2nd century AD, he made note of both epics, along with another mythological account, according to which it was the hero Perseus who founded the city. Either way, from its commanding position 900 feet above sea level, from where it controlled the strategic routes passing through the Isthmus of Corinth, as well as overlooking the core area of Achaean settlement on the plains of Argos. By as early as 1800 BC, though its origins remain shrouded in myth, Mycenae already seems to have emerged as the foremost settlement in the Argolid. Perhaps ruled over by an incoming warrior elite, with their roots on the distant steppes to the north of the Black Sea. By the time the first cist graves were laid down and protected by an outer circuit wall, the original fortification of the Acropolis, much of the population probably retained kinship with the Neolithic farmers who'd lived on the land for thousands of years. Though great changes in culture would continue to be ushered in, the communal ritual spaces that had predominated in the 3rd millennium no longer being favoured, whereas elaborate graves for single individuals now took precedence. A megaron and a royal palace were built on an elevated area overlooking the rest of the Acropolis, which was further separated from and surrounded by the lower settlement area outside. By the 17th century BC, the now famous Grave Circle, originally located outside the fortified Acropolis, was built and filled by illustrious individuals of the royal house. When excavated in the 19th century, the shaft graves here revealed ornate goods, weapons, and never-before-seen funerary items from the heroic past. Most famous of all being the golden funerary masks which accompanied the early Mycenaean kings into the afterlife, perhaps having antecedents in the funerary traditions of various steppe cultures of the Middle Bronze Age. Though incredible in itself, Grave Circle B was outshone by Grave Circle A of the 16th century BC in almost every way, being even more lavish in terms of its size and its contents. It was here that the so-called Mask of Agamemnon was so famously uncovered by German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. Incorrectly labelling it after the legendary Mycenaean king, who, if real, would have lived some 300 years later. Of the real chariot-riding elite interred in the early graves, besides their immensely wealthy grave goods and architecture, we know nothing. Only the briefest of foundational myths survive. Initially located just outside the imposing fortress walls. Grave Circle A was ultimately absorbed into the growing defences of the citadel when it was expanded, almost simultaneously being superseded by a new, even larger type of burial construction. For this was the age of the Mycenaean chamber tombs. Cut directly down into the bedrock, forming a tripartite structure known as a passageway or dromos. A stomion or threshold, and the chamber itself, known as a thalamos, where the Mycenaean nobles were laid to rest. All aspects of the tombs were expertly built and highly decorated, filled with grave goods, jewellery, and weapons of precious metals, gemstones, and gold. The most impressive and imposing of all Mycenaean funerary architecture, however, were the tholos tombs. Relatively similar in style to the chamber tombs, the tholoi took things to the next level, being much larger and less numerous, suggesting their reservation only for the very highest of the royals in Bronze Age Greek society. While in some cases, in a similar method to the chamber tombs, the passageway was cut from the bedrock itself, the stomion and thalamos were always built with fine masonry, consisting of layers of precious stones. They contained some of the most luxurious items that could be found anywhere in the Bronze Age Greek world. The late 16th and early 15th century tholos, known as the Tomb of Aegisthus, fully expresses the overwhelmingly evident early power of Mycenae. Located in the burial area just outside the Acropolis. At the time of its construction, it was very likely the largest tomb in all the Aegean. By the time the citadel was further enlarged in the 14th century BC, its earlier walls were reconstructed in a new style of masonry, perhaps inspired by similar techniques seen in the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, and beyond in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So impressive were the vast limestone boulders of hewn rock used in this new style, along with smaller stone chunks to fill in the gaps, that in later generations it would become known as Cyclopean, the term stemming from the belief that the boulders were so large they could not have been moved by the hands of mortal men, only by mythical Cyclopean colossi. Needless to say, like so much else, the technique to create such works had been lost in the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse. For those who came after, only adding to the allure of the heroic age. A new royal palace on the citadel was also constructed at this time, displaying the very peak of Mycenaean power. As well as a tholos tomb, even larger than the tomb of Aegisthus. The dromos of the so-called Treasury of Atreus was an astonishing 36 metres long, with a circular chamber or thalamos 14.5 meters in diameter and 13.2 tall. It was the largest tomb ever constructed in Bronze Age Greece, and one of the largest in the entire world. The corbelled dome stood as the largest in the world all the way until the Roman period, and still remains one of the largest to this day. The interior of the tomb was elaborately decorated with row upon row of marble columns and sculptures. An interior thought to have been inspired not just by Greece, but Minoan Crete and Pharaonic Egypt beyond. Given the similar architectural features of the citadel at the same time, it's thought that the tomb was constructed for the king of Mycenae during the golden age of the palace. Hence its mythic association with Agamemnon's ancestor, Atreus. During this very height of power in the Argolid, archaeologists today have estimated the population for the now substantial undertown of Mycenae to have been as high as 30,000. And of course, Mycenae was not alone. Just in the immediate landscape of the plains of Argos, a number of satellite centres are to be found. Most famous of all being the great port citadel of Tiryns. But many other power centres existed here too, evidenced by vast cyclopean bulwarks and forgotten hills. Just a couple of hours' walk from Mycenae, on an adjacent jagged hilltop, is one of them. In the centuries that followed the Bronze Age, great religious processions made their way across the plains and up here to worship and make offerings to the goddess Hera. Their destination was the Argive Heraion, still an immensely impressive visage today. Coated in gnarled trees, clusters of masonry, and colossal architecture of the ancients. For just like many places in classical Greece, it seems, the roots of those archaic celebrations may have stretched all the way back to the Age of Heroes. On the highest point of the hilltop, though much obscured by the later constructions, vast ancient masonry blocks are to be found. Cyclopean heaps, usually associated with Bronze Age occupation. There is another site, however, that remained unsubsumed by the ruins of a later age. To visit the Bourbati Valley today, though only a few kilometres from Mycenae as the crow flies, it seems an entirely forgotten land, left behind by the modern world. Encircled by towering mountains as it is, there were only a handful of ways in ancient times, just as there are today. The valley opening to the east, where an army could be marched, and secret, more treacherous footways across the mountains to Mycenae, suggesting its probable use as a private fiefdom of the rulers of the great citadel. Besides the magical feel to the place, the valley is full of archaeology. From Hellenistic towers and Roman bathhouses to the refuse of Paleolithic hunters of more than 10,000 years in the past. Over the last 100 years or so, the valley has been meticulously scoured by Swedish archaeologists. And yet, so many secrets remain. Most important for us today, however, are the Mycenaean tombs and adjacent citadel on Mastos Hill. Visible everywhere in the valley, dominating everything when you know it's there. Coated in trees today, a refuge for shepherds. Excavations have proved that this was the site of an important fortified stronghold for a Bronze Age polity. Almost certainly usurped or absorbed into the polity of Mycenae by around the 14th century BC. Though the details and the nature of this expansion remain obscure, other sites may reveal more secrets. Across the mountains to the north, heading out of the Argolis toward the Gulf of Corinth, yet more forlorn citadels are to be found. On the modern highway toward these borderlands of bygone days, a Mycenaean quarry site can still be seen. Dating to some 3,500 years ago, the vast blocks hewn out of the hillside here to build their great architecture are still visible on the roadside. Taking an exit toward the town of Vasilius, meaning king, a low mound coated in modern agriculture can be seen. Believe it or not, this was once the stronghold of Zigores, much dilapidated since its important excavations over 100 years ago by Carl Blagan and the like. Considered now by many researchers to have been the northernmost outpost and bastion of the core kingdom of Mycenae. Like Bubati, Zigores had likely been an independent state, subsumed into the growing kingdom in its heyday toward the end of the Bronze Age. Almost certainly the foremost polity in all of Greece. By the 13th century BC, Mycenae was even more heavily fortified, the walls being extended around the Acropolis for the second time, now placing the ancestral royals of Grave Circle A inside the fortifications. It was also during this time that the main entrance to the citadel was made even more grandiose, with its most famous and well-known feature being added: the Lion Gate. Perhaps inspired by similar constructions seen at the Hittite capital of Hattusha and elsewhere in the ancient Near East. This monumental construction stood above the double-gated entranceway, showing a representation of a column on top of an altar-like platform, flanked with 2 lions or lionesses. Eventually, both in the ancient period and today, the Lion Gate came to represent the most famous feature of all at Mycenae. The final extension of the citadel came in around 1200 BC, during the hypothetical age of the Trojan War. Unlike the mighty symbols of power of the previous constructions, however, the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century BC saw more purely defensive features added. The wall was extended one more time on the northeastern side, containing a sally port. Under the wall was a secret passage leading through a corbelled construction downward to a cistern carved out of rock around 15 metres below the surface. It was connected by a tunnel with a spring on more distant higher ground, which would have been useful in a siege, a sign of the troubled times that were on the way. For this period, just before the fall, saw Mycenae become the most heavily fortified palatial centre in all the Aegean. Very much now on the defensive. Though, as we shall see, it was far from the only heavily fortified site of the war-ready Mycenaean Greeks. If you enjoyed this brief exploration into the Mycenaean world, here's another 6.5 hours I made earlier, covering the entire rise and fall of that most ancient of Greek civilizations. Just click the link here and it'll take you to my main channel, History Time. Thanks, and see you next time.